Good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. I'm Alexander Gabuev. I am in charge of the Asian program of the Asian Center of Carnegie. Our panel is mostly composed of English-speaking people. To what extent we have Russian-speaking or English-speaking people? I may moderate in English. Is it okay for you?
All right.
It's okay with you? Okay.
See, Russia is pretty democratic. We just decided that I'm going to moderate in English. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making the time on this not so rainy day in Moscow after the World Cup to spend your time at the Moscow Urban Forum and discuss the pressing challenges of future of the urban world, which are visible here in Moscow and probably more visible throughout some parts of the world. My name is Alexander Gabuev. I'm chair of the Asia program here at the Moscow Carnegie Center, which is part of the Global Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I'll be moderating today's session, which is called Megacities of the Future, whether that's something apocalyptic or that's a new managerial reality that we have to face. I think that a couple decades ago, people wouldn't imagine a city which would comprise a population of about 100 million people. That was science fiction, nothing real. But you need to think that about 200 years ago, the Earth had just one city with population of 1 million. That was Beijing. Nowadays, we have many cities which are officially having a population of 1 million people. So probably a city which will have population close to 100 million, over 100 million, is not a distant future. And according to some predictions, we will have at least 5 cities of that size, at least towards the end of this century, if not by the middle. So let's talk about this prospect. What kind of new reality are we living in? Is it a nightmare? Is it happening at all? Or is it a new reality that we all should be prepared to? And I'm very happy that we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts to enlighten us on these issues and discuss all the challenges and opportunities arising. I will introduce them in the lineup that they are sitting, and then we jump into discussion. So right next to me is Kunle Adeyemi, who is the founder of a bureau called NLE. Next to him is Michael Blinking, who's familiar here in Moscow. He's director of Institute for Transportation Economy and Transportation Policy at the Harvard School of Economics. Gabriele Lanfranchi is director for City Program at CIPPEC and founder of MetroLab at MIT. And we have also Caroline Noels, who is a researcher at Goldsmith College at the University of London, and also head of Center for City and Infrastructure Research at the British Academy. And last but not the least, we have a new addition to our panel, Mr. Ding Xiao, who is director for Beijing Municipal Commission for City Planning and Management of Land Resources. Before we jump into the panel, I would announce some housekeeping rules. I think that we will have about 7 minutes for each presentation, if that's okay, because we really want to finish on time, and I will be a strict and rude moderator if possible. All right, with that in mind, I think, Gabriele, why don't I start with you? We see a lot of examples how these city regions, large agglomerations develop. There are many models of how cities expand to their current size. Your unit in MIT is studying different megacities. You worked in Buenos Aires. In which way will the megacity of the future will be different from large cities now? And what kind of environmental risks that might have in particular? And how do we mitigate those risks? Okay, you have your 7 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for your questions. I'm very honored to be here again in Moscow. it's one of the mega cities of the world, so we have to learn from cities like this one, right? First thing I would like to say is that we don't really know much what's going to happen in the future, even though there's a new profession called futuristics, and there's people working on that. I want to give you an anecdote. 3 years ago, I got invited to a very important meeting at the IDB, the transportation sector. And during that meeting, I asked, who of you thought about platforms like Uber 10 years ago? Nobody raised their hands. It was full of ministers of all the countries. And 5 years ago, only 2 persons. And when I said 2 years ago, half of the people. So things are changing so fast that having an idea on what could happen in 100 years is a very difficult take. Said so, I would like to share with you a couple of visualizations made by UNICEF actually. They take care of our children. And look, this is the 1950s, the times where my parents were born. 35% or 34% of the world was urbanized, and you can see there the countries and their level of urbanization. A couple of decades later, I was born in that decade, and you can see how, well, actually, almost. I was 5 years old in that decade, and you can see how the world, it went through the decade that where we are now, where my children have 5 years. So you can see how the world is getting fast and fast urbanized, and this is the prediction that we have for just for a couple of years when maybe my great children will have 5 years old. So it's true that the world is getting urbanized, that we're getting urbanized very rapidly. According to these predictions, we will build as much urban area in 15 years as in the rest of the whole time of human being here. So we want to double all that we have done in 6,000 years in just 15 years. And that's a little bit scary considering the trends that we are seeing and the impact that this has in the planet. This is a way we like to frame the challenges that we are studying. Instead of framing them from a sectorial point of view, as could be housing, transportation, land development, we think that we have to frame it into challenges. Firstly, inequality. Inequality is a big, big challenge that most of cities are going. 75% of the cities of the world are more unequal or more or less inclusive than 20 years ago. Resiliency is another aspect. How can we build climate resilient cities considering that the world is heating at a rate much beyond that we desired, and we won't be able to cope with the Paris Agreement if we don't radically change the way we are building cities. Consider that 70% of greenhouse emissions are coming from cities, 36% of greenhouse emissions are coming from the building and construction area, and so if we are going to double the size of the urban area in only 15 years, it means that we will have to deal a lot with pollution. So, on the other part of the frame, you will see what I call innovation, and where's our hope, where our hope should be. Firstly, digitalization. I think through digitalization we will see a radical change in cities, all the paradigm of a smart city, but not only that one, the sharing economy, the different platforms that could allow us somehow take profit of the resources that we already have and reduce the metabolism of a city. That's a very important one. And the other one is linked to governance. Governance, it will have to radically change. The way our cities are organized, the way metropolitan areas work together, because 85% of the cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants in the world are already metropolitan. This means that the world needs to understand how to take very difficult decisions in areas like inequality and resilience, with a perspective on collaboration, contribution among different, let's say, mayors, but also a multi-stakeholder approach that includes big companies, universities, and civil society. So we have to learn how to do that. Nobody's teaching us how to do that, at least not at school. And that's how we started at MIT this MetroLab initiative that is trying to get different people from different sectors and understand how can we deal with that. Well, this is a couple of slides that I will pass faster in order to understand these 4 challenges. And another aspect that we need to understand is that nations and cities somehow are competing. Why? Because now 80% of the wealth in the world is created in cities. But they are not receiving 80% of the resources. Resources are still kept at the national level. And that makes a sort of gap between the real problems that we have, as I mentioned before, greenhouse gases, and the possibility to find a solution to that. So urban growth, I think, is going to be key. And let me say that I don't totally agree that we don't see this 100 million city coming. I think that it's going to happen, and if we go 100 years later, let's think about New York. When they created the Central Park, the urbanization was very far from that area. So they really had an idea of what the city could be 100 years later, and we are not doing that during our generation. I don't know why. We have to change that. We really need to think how are we going to urbanize the areas that could be occupied by human settlements in order to avoid that. Another point, Tokyo already has 37 million people. So why not to think that they will reach the 100 million? So I don't think that the number is really a key. The most important thing is the governance, how we organize our society and the territory in order to grow in a different way. Yesterday was published in the T20, which is the think tank 20. It's the coordination of all the think tanks and research centers in the world that are bringing ideas to the G20. We published a policy brief written by more than 100 experts on how a new paradigm is necessary. Salvador Rueda was next door a couple of minutes ago. He's one of the authors as well. And we are seeing that if we don't radically shift the way we build cities, we're going to face terrible problems. So just to conclude, I would like to leave with a couple of numbers on these huge megacities are racing all around the world and how nations and metropolitan areas are competing. There you have a ranking of the 100 more powerful economies. You can see there are cities and nations competing, 42 metro areas against 58 cities. And we need to understand that this is going, for example, in different parts of the world. The macro metropolis in Sao Paulo, Brazil, this is one example. We could also know about China. I'm sure we will listen about this in a couple of minutes. But let's have a look also at the East Coast in the USA or Europe until this part of Russia. So this network of cities is already happening and we need to work very much on their governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that's a terrific overview. As far as I understand, some of these cities will be in the global south, and I know that Caroline is looking into those issues a lot. So, Caroline, you're leading a group which is doing 18 interdisciplinary groups studying such kind of cities in the global south. So, what are the key trends that are shaping this new agglomeration, and what are the challenges there?
Thank you. I have some photographs, if I can show them. I don't know. It's not doing anything.
Да, есть у нас слайды.
Okay, thank you. We've heard, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I think I agree with the mayor of Moscow. When we speak about megacities, it's important to keep people and everyday lives at the center of our concerns, and also to think about what kind of city it is that we want to live in. We've heard a lot in the last 2 days about megacities and their shiny projects. Moscow, of course, and other cities across the Russian Federation are great examples of building for people and paying attention to the street. But the most rapid developments in megacities are in the global south, in Asia and Latin America. Megacities like Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Lagos, which has 21 million. So the megacities of the future will be in sub-Saharan Africa. By 2045, 6 billion people will live in cities, and we know that cities are crucibles of development challenges, engines of economic growth, prosperity, social experiment, and widening social inequalities, as you rightly mentioned. Cities are, of course, junctions routing all kinds of activities and cross-currents in movements of people, objects, algorithms, and materials. And I don't need to remind you that cities condense the challenges we face today of climate change, sustainability, food security, vulnerability, fragility, displacement, access, and exclusion. The former president of Mexico spoke passionately just this afternoon about this. Megacities expand through population growth, rural to urban migration, and multi-causal displacements from flooding, earthquakes, to the political and visceral violence that produces refugees. As the everyday needs of urban citizens in megacities of the global south in particular exceed authorities' abilities to provide for them, people improvise viable lives for themselves. So cities are invented by those who live in them as much as they are planned. They are informal, off-grid. Cities of the global north and south are different in fabrics and possibilities and in the lives that can be lived there. The largest growth is in the informal cities, the peripheries, the slums, not the formal, planned and smart cities we've been hearing about. The World Bank says 70% of the population of Lagos, for example, lives in slums, in informal off-grid settlements. And I think we need to be concerned about the connections between these people and the official cities of architects and planners. These off-grid cities are what we might call cities of now, cities in which people must act in different ways without preparation, grasping opportunities in motion. These are taken in Beijing, for example, where we must try to unravel the storylines, the things that connect the stories that people tell about themselves, and keep multiple stories in place simultaneously, where we need to work with the practiced resourcefulness of people and incorporate it into our plans and calculations, where the rhythms of the city and the choreographies of its residents are what count and make place through temporary shifting dynamics. For me, the question is, what conceptions of a city can better provide everyday lives for those who live with fragile, shifting, and collapsing circumstances? We need conceptions of everyday life, of urbanism, everyday urbanism, in which lives are held in more robust and sustainable structures of well-being, with access to basics like energy, water, and shelter. 2 nights ago, a mayor from Uganda told me that what his city needed was street lighting. Sometimes solutions are very simple. Infrastructure is an important practical and theoretical tool in megacity making. Infrastructure holds against the fragilities of collapse. Infrastructure makes cities work. Infrastructure is a way of looking at cities in cities' multiple possibilities. I mean infrastructure in its broadest sense, a matrix of urban fabrics, material, virtual, human, often combined in unexpected and creative ways in meeting everyday needs. Infrastructures are a fast emerging set of technical possibilities that interact with human creativity in dealing with everyday challenges. Infrastructure is a practical tool in city making, which also provides a way of thinking about cities in more inclusive ways. I want to suggest some ways of moving forward in improving the off-grid cities of the global south. These comments come from research funded under the UK's official government aid programme through the British Academy's Cities and Infrastructure scheme. 17 interdisciplinary research projects combining disciplines from engineering to arts and anthropology in UK universities, providing improvements for the poorest and most marginalised citizens in the global south, along experts in partner cities like Nairobi, Kampala, Medellin, Rio, Kathmandu, Lagos, Accra. Moving forward demands different forms of creativity than some of those we've been discussing, working with the tensions of city life, developing open-minded approaches to emerging urban form that express the multiple lives that are lived in megacities. Modest, grounded, mid-level approaches that can be modified to work in a number of different situations. Experimentation is very important. Are smart cities a solution? Well, sometimes they are, but sometimes stupid cities are the solution. City improvements do not just trickle down to everyone. I think that's been one of the underlying assumptions of this forum. They do not necessarily make sense in the most marginal lives, which are cast around the shifting pragmatics of survival. New infrastructures in megacities displace as well as serve populations. In one of our projects in Lahore, a new train line disrupts the lives, livelihoods, and communities of the city's marginal off-grid residents. We need to better understand and work with the tensions between developments in infrastructure on the one hand and dispossessions on the other. We need better research to understand the logics of the off-grid and marginal cities. In particular, we need to understand cities through the relentless improvised city-making of the poor. And we need to work more closely with them so that the benefits of improvement are extended to all. Finally, in making megacities better and more beautiful places to live, we need to pay attention to 3 points. Firstly, rights to the city. Cities don't need to exacerbate social inequalities. The benefits of urban improvement can be extended to the off-grid cities and communities beyond city footprints. Where megacities ends is anyway an interesting question. Secondly, we need robust resistance as well as collaboration with the financialization of cities. Of course, city building is in private hands, but proper regulation reduces rent-seeking and privatization of land and basic infrastructure like water, energy, and garbage disposal. And finally, I want to stress the importance of experimental urbanisms that incorporate the resourcefulness of citizens into the design and improvement of megacities, and especially those who live off the formal grid and have to invent viable lives for themselves. What kind of city do we want to live in? Surely not a city of slums. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I think that I particularly like the point that the city making is really happening in the slums and many other ugly parts of megacities that usually we don't talk about, and they should be somehow connected to the beautiful world of smart cities and everything that what the governments or officials in charge like to talk about. And I thank you so much for being so constructive and precise. I think that infrastructure was mentioned, and here I want to turn to Mikhail Blinken. Mikhail, I think that mobility and transportation seems to be one of the obvious challenges for this type of cities. So how do you see this part of the megacities developing, and how do we mitigate those challenges going forward?
We are in the hall dedicated to Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren is a famous English architect who reconstructed London after the fire of 1666. I'm the oldest one here in the audience. I do remember these times. And what was the size of London in 1666? 80,000 people. Within the radius of like 2.53 kilometers, that was the pedestrians area. And what about individual vehicles in 1666 or in Moscow in 1900? The number was the same. About 10 carriers per 1,000 citizens. And an individual vehicle before the invention of Ford looked like the barn, the horse stable, and several yards surrounding this area. And it was not business but luxury category. And that was how the ancient cities were structured up to 1920. What is 100 million? If we take the density of the population today in Moscow, so if we have such a density from Zaryadye to the town of Noginsk, well, 100 million could be positioned within that radius. But if it is like 10 carriers per 1,000 people, everyone will be accommodated. But that will be a nightmare. I had my neighbor here from Massachusetts University. If we take the population of Big Boston, that's 20 people per hectare. 20,000 people per hectare, and 100 million city was the one from Zaryadye to Tula. And I'm going to having a tour to Boston in a week, and I'm going to measure it somehow, this density. And actually, in London, we have 700 vehicles per 1,000 citizens, and everyone is accommodated. And a couple of years ago, I visited Beijing, and we discussed the issue of megacity clusters. And my friends from the Netherlands started telling what was going on in North Westphalia and the Netherlands, and it looked like a megacity. But and I had a professor just nearby. He was on the verge of laughing, and he started talking about the megacity cluster around Beijing, and that is not at all a futurology. That's the current status. The question arises, why do we need so many people in one city? It's going to be comfortable and easy to live there. My colleagues are discussing the problem of Global South. The question arises, why do we need this Global South? Why do these people stay in the cities and towns? They have no profession, the ability to feed the family. Why do we out them from the natural environment and put them onto the urban area? People have nothing to do there. And some national or subnational bodies have to resolve their destiny. And they involve people there who have higher productivity, labor productivity, and who are creative and skilled. That's the one thing. But when people from nowhere come and they do not do anything, how are we going to feed them? Let's get back to the statistics. One person in a very good country like Canada or the United States has 80 square meters of floor space area. And by the American norms, his car has accommodated 400 square feet. Yes, and that's just per car, per person. What do we have in Moscow? It's like 35, 40 square meters. The car doesn't know where it lives. But in Moscow, we have 22 square meters of accommodation, and actually car has more space in America than here in Russia. Actually, we are meeting these challenges and we need to address them, and the technology of mobility in the cities of the future will look absolutely different. And we have SAEF shared autonomous driving of electric vehicles. That's what is our future. That's principally different public transport of the future. But it is the subject matter of another section. Technically, it is feasible to have so many people in one place. But we have to think about the square meters of ratio between the physical person and the car, for example. Why do we need poor and low qualified qualified people onto the mega cities, and we really have to think of them so that they not die there.
All right, I think that we have to turn to case studies. Kunle, I think Lagos is something on everybody's mind. That's one of the fastest developing cities, and it's in the global south, and it has a lot of the challenges that are already mentioned. It's both infrastructure, it's migration of people from rural area with traditional way of life to the city and absorption into the city life, and it's probably slums driving the expansion of the city before city planning and the city planners trying to figure out how to navigate this landscape. So what are the challenges? What are your major takeaways working in Lagos? And how can Lagos experience inform our thinking about megacities of the future that may host this type of populations?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I just want to start by saying I run a small practice called Unle, and we're a small practice with a very mega vision. And fundamentally, we believe in the diversity and coexistence of humanity and the environment. That's the core. And on that note, I'd like to thank the Moscow Urban Forum for inviting me here to increase the diversity. Well, to talk about Lagos specifically, I'd like to start with Africa as a continent. We've heard a lot about that today. And just to put it in perspective, of course, Caroline and I think Gabrielle have mentioned the impact of the growth on the continent being one of the largest, fastest urbanizing continents after Asia. And just a few years ago, Africa was said to be the hopeless continent, and less than 10 years later, it's said to be a rising continent. And we're seeing that happening a lot. Nigeria specifically being the largest African country with currently over 180 million people is said to will be rivaling China's population by 2,100. So this is a very huge population growth that we're expecting. However, it's not all doom and gloom. We're already seeing other kinds of impacts of this population growth in creativity industry with the rise of the arts and culture, music, food, fashion. These are signs that the environment and the economies are improving. At the same time, we are not all optimistic. There are challenges which we also think are opportunities. So I like to show this picture a lot because it's of New York, which is the sort of epicenter of a modern city and an urbanized city. So basically capturing what I would say the two important challenges of our time, urbanization, at the same time, New York showing the impact of climate change, where half of it is flooded. So flooding became, and you know, the whole impact on the continent, which we've heard a lot throughout the days here. So the issues of urbanization and climate change, particularly, have forced us to begin to really think differently, to consider how to build differently, particularly that we need to learn to live differently. With a large section of cities all over the world being around water, Moscow being one of such, and particularly on the African continent that you have nearly 70% of these cities also by water. So you have all these great cities, Cape Town, Dakar, Dar es Salaam, and Lagos, which are main cities. Now we've not just found that these cities are expanding on the continent, but we also see little settlements that are by these coastal areas being challenged by the impact of climate change. So Africa, which is the second urbanizing continent in the world, is said to be one of the least responsible for climate change, but is actually one of the most affected by it. So we are already seeing changes in the environmental conditions, shifts in the climatic conditions. And one of the most obvious impacts of climate change is flooding. But we also see that not only as a risk or a challenge, but really that everyday people are beginning to take this as an opportunity with people already having a great time and being innovative. So Lagos specifically, back to your question, it's a city on water, and it's a large city with nearly 21 million people currently, and with statistics, it's said to be growing very rapidly. Now, right in the center of it is a slum. Like Caroline mentioned, there are different settlements all over where these growths are happening, off-grid cities, so to speak. And Makoko is one such, which is really in the heart of the city. And a few years ago, I'll just take you through very quickly one response, I would say, or kind of approach that we began to look at by looking at this community that had lived, that is growing quite rapidly. The density is probably as dense as Paris. It's got about 100,000 people living on stilts, really on water. And that's just how people live. This is kind of a typical home that with, form of transportation that people kind of move around. That gentleman there has a family of maybe 6 children, but he lives in this, this house, this little thing that he's built for himself. And we, decided to learn how this man has been able to create his own city, adapting to the climate conditions. And perhaps if we can learn from him, we can develop a way of addressing the challenges while also looking at the opportunities for ways of urbanizing in an environment. So this led to a bit of an innovation to create a floating platform that would adapt. With that platform, we built with the community this very simple floating structure, kind of a minimum viable product that sat in the community in Lagos for a few years as a first prototype of a floating structure that you can actually build with local materials, with local labor, and create a new kind of urban environment. This was 7 years ago. In 2016, we built the second version, which became more standardized. So we basically started taking what was informal into kind of formal context, making it an industrial product. And recently, we've just built the third version, which is now built to Eurocode, has a 25-year lifespan. Basically, it's a building system that enables people to build themselves. It's modular, it's easy to assemble, very little heavy equipment, and that's the idea, that we can create a structure that lives on water, that uses material. Systems are quite simple. It's prefabricated. It's being used, and whether it's in Bruges like that or in Lagos, in a very poor community, it's about bridging equality, addressing challenges of climate change, and perhaps we can use this and other kinds of intelligence around the world to begin to create a new form of urbanization that both is not about fighting climate change or fighting water, but actually learns to live with it, where all kinds of conditions coexist, diversity in terms of infrastructure, in terms of people, green economy, and just kind of an environment that will adapt to the challenges and also opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Terrific. Okay, another example on the opposite side would be China and Beijing. Mr. Ding, we know that Chinese government has a plan for everything for many decades to come. And the experience of Moscow Urban Forum, we did a session in Shanghai about a year ago. And there, the City Planning Commission of Shanghai discussed at length how they're trying to prepare the city and the cities nearby, like Suzhou, Hangzhou, and others, for what's about to come in 2 or 3 decades. So what's the experience of Beijing and China in planning the cities for the future? Please. Коллеги, это будет последовательный перевод, поэтому...
It is consecutive translation.
北京呢，有着悠久的历史、灿烂的文化，有着3000年的建城史、800年的建都史。
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say that Beijing has a pretty long history of development, and we have a 3,000 years experience of city planning and 800 years experience of construction of our capital city.
我们有100万人口，现在我们有2170万人口。200年前我们的城市只有2环，现在呢我们城市有3环、4环、5环、6环，甚至7环。
Just 200 years ago, Beijing was the city which overcame the population, let's say, notch of 1 million people. Now we have 21.8 million people, and 200 years ago we had only 2 let's say rings, circular rings in Beijing. Now we have 3 and 4 transportation rings.
也会受到资源的制约和影响。北京的年均降水量只有600毫米，远远不能满足这么大城市的需求。
As any other big city, Beijing has its own city illnesses, and among other things, overcrowding, congestion. Their annual precipitation rate is about 600 cubic meters, and Beijing, in principle, cannot fully meet all the needs of its citizens.
为了解决上述问题呢，我们编制了新的城市总体规划。
We have a certain plan of city planning going forward.
北京的城市定位就是4个中心，也就是政治中心、文化中心、科技中心，还有这个国际交往中心。
I would like to call your attention to the fact that we're considering Beijing from the perspective of developing of 4 centers. It's a political center, it's a cultural center, an international exchange center, and the National Technology Innovation Center.
我们放眼于更广阔的空间，把首都的功能放在京津冀的范围内来考虑。 也就是发挥北京的核心作用，带动形成以环首都的一个世界级的城市圈。这个。
I'm sorry.
这个。
We also view the capital from the point of view of a broader notion of their capital. We view it as one center, one nucleus, one subcenter, 2 axes, and one district with multiple points.
城市发展过程中呢，我们划定了3条红线，也就是人口红线、生态红线和城市的增长边界。
This plan also assumes defining 3 lines of limits. We have 3 red lines, as we call them. These are such indicators as the population limit, environmental control limit, and urbanizing limit. As for population control, we expect that by 2020 we are going to have 23 million people in our city. As for environmental ecological control line, the ecological control line will embrace about 70% by 2035, when the figure will still increase. The borderline is for urban development control line. Its urban areas divided into a number of areas. That's constructive expansion, limited constructive expansion, and environmental control area. The scale of use of urban and rural construction will be reduced from 245,000 square meters in 2016 to 2,000 square kilometers in 2020, and by 2035 just to 2,700 square kilometers. We also have to pay attention to integration of working, living, and environmental spaces. Beijing will carry out moderate construction of suitable for living space with a view to improve living conditions of its citizens. And with proper support, will be able to increase the share of, let's say, living space. The living space to industrial relation will increase from 1.3 to 1 to 1.5 to 1. Beijing attaches a lot of importance to the quality of environment and its scale, green planning of municipal space, using the system 1 barrier, 3 rings, and 9 rivers will also be applied. And forestry area in the city will increase to 44% by 2035. As for improvement of the living standards, the master plan embraces some issues which are yet outstanding. Beijing will consider both the symptoms and the reasons of congestion, and the network of the underground trains will dramatically increase to at least 2,500 kilometers by 2035. Beijing will create a system of housing which will encourage not only purchase but also leasing of floor space. And in the next 5 years, will provide about 1.5 million new houses.
我们落实了102项任务。
Under this master plan, we put together an implementation scheme, and we already completed 102 tasks.
通过我们的努力，我们一定会建设成为一个宜居的城市。
It seems to me that this master plan will be implemented step by step, and all our targets will be reached. Thank you.
Water diversity. We have about 2,500 kilometers of metro lines in Beijing in a couple of decades. And at the same time, we talk about some IKEA-like structures for places like Lagos that will be sustainable and will fit into the local landscape and will be easy to build and accessible for people. So what a diversity of options. I think that we are about to finish, but before we do so, I want to really do a very quick going through the panel. One question is, do you think that a city with population about 100 million people is a dystopia, or that's a reality we're going to prepare for, let's say in 50 years? Point number one. Point number two, I think that a lot of speakers have been saying that governance and our approach is the key. So what is your just one major takeaway on how do we tackle challenges discussed throughout this panel? Okay, I'll start with you, Kunle, and then we go in that direction.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think the data points to the fact that these are realities in terms of population growth. And I frankly believe the capacity, the resource, the human intelligence, collective human intelligence is enough to deal with this growth. So I don't think it's a dystopia particularly. I think it's actually an opportunity, because there's with any kind of demographic, there's always a correlation between demographic growth and, let's say, economic development and social development generally in the world. So it really depends on how it is dealt with. To your question about governance, I think that's indeed one important aspect of how this will be quickly addressed, because part of what is holding back the capacity for human adaptation to this growth, so we have growth both in human population, but also rapid changes in the environmental conditions. And I think the government policies that should need to change and need to adapt to enable these things to happen in a much more responsive way. So there are regulations that do not allow certain kinds of changes, whether it is growth, whether it is even the ability to develop new economies on water, in the ocean, to deal with the climate change. So that's a very, very big issue. And then everything else is really around how, let's say, the human intelligence adapts to these things.
All right, terrific. Mikhail.
Вот мой испанский друг
my Spanish friend Jose Posibili, who was the chief architect of Barcelona for a long time, in answer to such questions said very briefly, you could live in the city, but you should not live in such city. It is not the matter of my professional aspect, that like transportation. Well, there is solid waste, sewage waste. You should think about that. Yes, technically you can do that, we can calculate, but do we need that? Thank you. Gabriel.
I think we... Hello? Yeah. I think we don't need poor people to go to megacities. We don't need to rise global warming. We don't need to get more connectivity and more technology, but it's happening. So what we really need is governance, and I don't think it's a dystopia either. I think it's happening, and we need to learn how to phrase that. So regarding governance, I think that we need to go very fast through public policy innovation. We have to be ready to innovate in the same way we are innovating with technology. We need to innovate in the way cities are organized. We need to create metropolitan bodies. This should be shaped in the way every city needs. I know here in Moscow this year has been an agreement between different governments. I think we're going to see the race of paradiplomacy more and more. The U20 is an example of that this year. And finally, we will see civic participation changing a lot through technology and through commitment with these issues.
All right, Caroline.
I agree with Kunle. It's an opportunity and a challenge. So my point is collaborate with, work together with the urban poor. They're not unskilled, they're actually highly skilled. And what they're skilled at is survival in adverse circumstances, and we should take that into account. But municipal authorities need to build basic urban infrastructure and make sure everyone has access to it.
回答第一个问题，就是我认为未来的话，因特和物联网的发展，我们很多需要城市物理空间服务来解决的服务问题，我们通过科技进步可以解决。我们甚至可能全世界都是一个城市。
As to the response to the first question, I do assume that the cities with a population of 100 million may emerge in the foreseeable future if technologies are successful and if internet is successful, Wi-Fi as well. And via internet, we will be able to learn more about the needs of general public and the need to expand the cities to a specific level.
我们现在现实的最有效的治理方式就是网格的治理方式，也就是把城市化成一个网格，每一个网格有一个责任主体来负责。
As to your second question, what kind of management model we may prefer? I guess it should be the network approach, provided we subdivide the city onto various districts, and there should be a person in charge for every district to control the situation in that particular district. And in this case, we could easily manage the city.
First takeaway, it's happening, it's real. There's going to be such big cities, probably sooner than we expect. Point number two, I think this session has been more around problem setting, but the next session, which will be in 15 minutes, which is called Urban Tech, the city as a platform for venture, will explore solutions because it will explore how a city can be a good environment and platform for technological companies that are developing solutions. Before we part, I ask everybody to join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you so much.